So anyway, we are on. What I'm going to do tonight is take you through some issues around systems thinking and what it is. But before I start, do you have any of you have any general questions for me right now about course material, what you're doing, anything you want to ask me in general about the course?
No, the only question I would have is maybe at the end, if you can just kind of touch on next week's assignment, the writing assignment, just so I have a better feel for what I need to accomplish for next week.
Okay. Yeah. I'll go over that a little bit towards the end, so that you have a sense of what that is. And basically, I could probably do it right now. Really, what I want you to do is you've been looking and reading and watching some things about this whole concept around change, and particularly, as I said, you basically have to read Fulton's book, which is pretty easy. It's not a hard read. So all I really want you to do is to put together, a format that really articulates what you believe change is about, and utilize any of your insights that you've looked at so far, what you're gathering, because what I want you to do with this, again, and I'm using APA format from point of view that when you cite people, I want you to use the APA format for that, because that's what you're going to have to do going forward in your writing. But basically, this is going to give me, but more importantly, give you a sense of, again, your baseline thinking about the change process. So you did that with your day in the life. That kind of served as your baseline for what you think leadership is about. Now what I really want you to get into is really to begin to articulate your concept of change and what change is. And tonight we're going to go through, I have a couple video clips that will get you to really begin to understand what's happening around change process, particularly on a global scale. And we're going to use robotics as the mechanism for that. So that's basically what I want you to do in that paper. So does that help?
That's perfect. Yep.
Okay. All right. So, and as usual, anytime you have any questions about anything, the mechanism is, email me. I will try to get back to you either through an email, or if we have to talk face to face, we can do a Skype or in Zoom. So that's the framework that I really want you, to utilize, and don't feel that you are bothering me by sending me something. That's how we deal with it. And also, I'm hoping as you communicate within your teams, if different types of issues come up or ideas that you want me to deal with coming out of your own team process, let me know what they are. So that's the idea of what this is about. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you into a little deeper dive into this concept about systems thinking, and really begin to start getting you to think about complexity as a mechanism that is related to a lot of rapid change and uncertainty, whether it be at the political level, the social level, the learning level, organizational level, or and personal level. So these are some of the things that we're going to be looking at. So what I want you to think about is, and again, when you listen to Peter Senge and you read his ideas, basically what we're looking at in terms of systems thinking is this idea that you begin to understand that any type of relationship that you're in, whether it's a family or it's a school or in a business, is really a way of looking at the networks of dependencies and what those networks of communication are, so that when you are trying to understand a system and lead a system, you're always looking at it from the whole instead of paying attention just to its parts. And in education in particular, our tendency is to focus on parts as opposed to the whole. And what happens is, so for example, if you think about No Child Left Behind, from an educational and an ethical point of view, that makes a lot of sense. But the mechanisms for doing that basically has ended up that many times we're leading more and more kids behind, because our tendency is we only focus on certain types of areas, whether it just be reading and math and now science, at the expense of other areas of learning that are just as important and are interconnected to the development of academics. So the concept of systems thinking, to get you to look at that, really is that when you're dealing with an issue within any of your organization, and an organization is the classroom, it can be the building, it can be principal level, it can be the entire school district, is that you need to look at the interacting parts. You just can't focus on one avenue. So that's the framework for what systems thinking is about. And what I want you always to remember as you go through this program is basically this, is that the structure affects behavior of people over time. So the way in which you acted today in your organization has a lot to do with the way in which that organization is structured. And the structure of an organization, so if it's in a school system, those things that are structured are the mannerisms and the habits of actions that we do. So structure is the curriculum, structure is the schedule, structure is the contract, structure is school board policies, it's state policies, etc. And they have a tendency to impact our daily, our individual actions and behaviors. And many times what happens is, if we're not aware that the impact of the structure, what happens is then we have this tendency to just keep doing the same old over and over again, no matter what the situation is. So that's an important concept that systems thinking brings about, is that impact of structure upon our behavior. So as you look at what Peter Senge always has said, is that the tendency from an educational point of view, and you'll see this in Schools That Learn and also in the Russell Ackoff material, is that we really have gone to school too long. And that what Peter talks about is this idea that the way in which the structure of the school is organized and has been organized, really, life is not like a school. And even our language, we say to kids, wait till you get into the real world, as though they're not living in the real world now, or the school is not in the real world. So it becomes important to think about how our language, shows how that structure is impacted on us. And also that life in itself is highly dynamic and it's interconnected. So again, as we move through and I'm going to tell you 20 weeks, not 10 weeks, 800, you're going to be dealing with systems thinking. But when we get into, and I believe the new number of the course that we'll be going through next quarter is 845, we're going to be moving into this concept that's called Theory U, which will really get you into a deep dive into your own thinking as a learner and as a leader. But as Peter said, and the reason I call him Peter is because we've developed pretty good friendship over the last 10 years. And what he says is, and he says this, all the time, is that when you get a doctorate, I want you to think about this, is that a doctorate means you know a lot about a little. And that's what the nature of what schooling does to us many times. And that what we have to begin to think about is, from the structure of schools, how do we get the structure of school to interconnect again with community and with life in general? So I think that's an important concept, that I want you to think about, particularly when you look at Russell Ackoff's work and you look at Michael Fullen's work that you're reading around change process and what Ackoff talks about. So really, the concept then that I want you to really begin to engage in is that really leadership, good leadership, really depends on the quality of attention and intention that the leader brings to any situation. So when you read that, does that make sense to you? Or, you know, how do you understand what you're seeing there? Not the artwork, the concepts. So how do you interpret that?
I just think to me, it's attention to detail and the qualities you bring to the table in terms of your own self and what your own experiences have been.
Okay. Anyone else? I'm sure you've all seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You remember it was Ben Stern was the teacher in there saying, anybody? Anybody?
Can you repeat the question?
Can I repeat the question? The question is, when you look at this concept that successful leadership really depends upon that quality of your attention and intention that you bring to any situation, that's what makes leadership successful. So does that make sense to you, or is it, you know, is it something different?
It does make sense. I mean, like you said earlier, it's about looking at whatever the circumstance or problem is holistically and not looking at just one small aspect within, you know, the global issue.
Okay. All right. Anyone else will make a comment? Okay. So with that then is really then as you begin to look at this stuff, I want you to think about it that really the core of leadership, and particularly when you look at Linsky and Heifetz, when they talk about the difference between adaptive and technical change processes in an organization, is that it's really about shifting or shaping and shifting how individuals that you're working with or the group attends to any response to a situation. So the more you're aware of that's really what we're talking about in terms of developing the core competencies, particularly in this EDD program. So this is something that you're going to hear me talk about quite a bit. You'll hear other professors begin to dive into this as we look at this leadership process. So what I want you to do now is to think about, you know, this. And I hope you can hear this.
Imagine a pair of horses in the early 1900s talking about technology. One worries all these new mechanical muscles will make horses unnecessary. The other reminds him that everything so far has made their lives easier. Remember all that farm work? Remember running from coast to coast delivering mail? Remember riding into battle? All terrible. These new city jobs are pretty cushy, and with so many humans in the cities, there will be more jobs for horses than ever. Even if this car thingy takes off, he might say, there will be new jobs for horses we can't imagine. But you, dear viewer, from beyond 2000, know what happened. There are still working horses, but nothing like before. The horse population peaked in 1915. From that point on, it was nothing but down. There isn't a rule of economics that says better technology makes more better jobs for horses. It sounds shockingly dumb to even say that out loud, but swap horses for humans and suddenly people think it sounds about right. As mechanical muscles pushed horses out of the economy, mechanical minds will do the same to humans. Not immediately, not everywhere, but in large enough numbers and soon enough that it's going to be a huge problem if we're not prepared, and we're not prepared. You, like the second horse, may look at the state of technology now and think it can't possibly replace your job, but technology gets better, cheaper, and faster at a rate biology can't match. Just as the car was the beginning of the end for the horse, so now does the car show us the shape of things to come.
So if you saw 60 Minutes on Sunday, the lead section on that was driverless cars. That every single major manufacturer is going after driverless cars for the simple reason that they save lives and the types of cars that they are looking at. So if you did not see this, on 60 Minutes, go into their online 60 Minutes and watch that and what it's doing. Now, the thing that's important about why I'm showing you this particular clip is that there's a lot of change around us going on outside of schools and within communities. And the question is, are our schools really prepared structurally to deal with some of the realities that you're going to see? And I want you to think about that, as we go through this process, because one of the things that I think that is important about thinking about leading for the future, and as I put here, these poor horses, they can't solve the problem with the same kind of thinking that creates them, the old Einstein concept. So the bigger question is, can we? And are we structured appropriately in terms of our schools right now to deal with this emerging world that is extremely complex? And I'll show you some what I'm going to call placeholders for you to think about this emerging world. So the first one definitely deals with technology. So as I take you through this, I just want you to think about those of you who are in the K-12 environment and actually in higher ed. I just want you to think about what's changing, what's happening, but more importantly, think about the types of kids that we're beginning to see and what their world is like, as opposed to what we believe their world should be. So I think that becomes an important concept as we begin to look at this. So one of the things we're going to start exploring is this concept of mental models. And remember, I told you, I think in the first thing when I showed you the iceberg concept, is that what becomes important is understanding what the concept of mental models are. And obviously my dog is down there barking away, complaining, if you can hear him. So mental models, as I said to you the first time, really are these images and assumptions. They're the stuff right now, as you listen to this, you're saying, what's he talking about? Huh? Yeah, maybe I agree with this. But nah, that's not real. So that's the stuff that goes on inside of your head because of your experiences, your own histories of how you see the world. And they're highly transformative. But what happens is, when you're thinking about this concept of mental models, is we're always asking the question, what about the thinking that allows these things to happen? And so what are the assumptions, what are the habits of action that you yourself have? So I just showed you this short clip about the fact that we had these two Luddite horses talking to each other, talking about change process. But the question then is okay, what's going on? Why is this happening? And what impact does it have on me, number one, as a human being, number two, as an educator, and what's its relationship to my ability to function on a daily level, given all the complexity that I have to work with? So let me just stop there. Does any comments or thoughts based on what I just said to you?
Dr. Gould, I have a thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm on the headphones, so excuse the noise level in the background. So I think that there is a push within schools now to utilize technology. However, in the urban setting, which I teach and come from, I feel it's being implemented in a poor fashion. So yeah, we start to incorporate technology into content areas such as math, English, history, and science. But at the same time, when a student is now on the computer and should be independent to learn the content, as far as differentiation of instruction, in my district, they don't block other websites. So they're on the computer it's 20 kids in the class. The teacher's walking around making sure they're doing whatever they can on the actual work. But then the students are also on other websites, which then also takes away from the total learning that could be occurring. So I think and that's just for me in the district that I work and in the setting that I work. I don't know if it happens in other settings, but I think the is definitely in effect, but implementation is done poorly, and so it's counterproductive. That's just my opinion.
Okay, good. Okay. And when you think about technology, particularly, from a structural point of view, we've spent, I'm going to say, we're over $1 billion over the last 20 years with the implementation of technology from the very early stages to where it is now. And what I ask teachers and I ask administrators all the time, remember I was the superintendent of schools and I did the same thing as we were doing this, is that you tell me what has really changed, from a structural point of view. Days, the schedule, the curriculum, it's all the same. It's, technology is designed to make, information ubiquitous. It crosses all sectors. It integrates, science and math and music and all those things together. But still what we've tried to do is make something that is highly interconnected fit the boxes of the structure of our schools today. So that's a good example of as you begin to look at this idea of what the technology or the potential of that tool can do to the daily structure of a school, when what we've really done is we don't understand it, so we try to make it fit the present structure, which is a series of first grade, second grade, third grade, all up the line, actually into the university level quite a bit also. So that's what we're thinking about. What are those assumptions? What are those images you have, and how do they impact your perception of what leadership is about, but more importantly about how and why things happen within your daily activities, within your role in your job. So this concept of mental model is extremely important, and that what you're going to be looking at is, all right, the federal government, the state government, but more importantly, business people have decided that there's a common set of learning that everybody needs to know, and it's highly structured in a way that it makes it hierarchical, with reading and math and science now at the top, but art and music and all these other areas are lower on the totem pole. The question is, does the neurosciences or our understanding of brain function support that old model? And it's not there to answer that tonight, but it's something I want you to think about, from a structural point of view, and how you function as a leader to get people to surface their underlying assumptions, whether it be technology, whether it be Common Core, whether it be any type of standards-based assessment, whatever it might be. Because until you get people to surface their assumptions about a particular component within any organization, it becomes extremely difficult to really make that organization move forward. The tendency is to maintain status quo. Okay? So one of the things that is very important to think about is, and it comes out of a book that was written in the 70s, The Zen and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I came back to read again, never realized that it was such a famous systems book. But what Persing says, and it's something I want all of you, to keep in mind, that if a factory is torn down, but the rationality that put that factory up is not changed also, we'll simply build another factory. So if you think about school reform, and you begin to think about reform in light of the structure, then many times what has happened with school reform and the leaders that are leading it is really that we're trying to tear down this thing we always call the industrial model, But in reality, we never look at the underlying assumptions or rationality that brought it together. And so what we end up doing is producing another factory. So if you think about charter schools, and that's one thing I look at quite a bit, is that charter schools on the surface are designed in a way to allow new rationalities to emerge in terms of the structure of schools. But when you look at most charter schools, they don't look any different than what they're replacing. Now, there are some that are very unique, but by and large, charter schools, in essence, really just reproduce another factory, because the rationale of understanding new ways of learning and thinking about grouping of kids, etc., never comes into play. So I want you to think about that, as you start going through this, because the mental models of why education from pre-K all the way through adult training many times is subjugated to a rationale that is well over 300 years old. And I'll show you that in a couple minutes. Okay? Any comments, questions so far? It's okay to challenge. That's what this is about. So what I want to show you really quickly is this issue is really what are the ones that are, underlying our system. So I want to go back to this. And this is basically 17th and 20th century thinking. And we're looking at Galileo and we're looking at Descartes. And particularly Descartes, when he said, I think, therefore I am, that's what separated the mind, the rationality, from the heart. And so and one way you see that coming out in the structure of schooling over time is we have academic and we have vocational. Vocational is that hands-on, touchy stuff, putting things together that way, whereas the academic is in the mind. The two don't match. So we can thank Descartes for that, but Galileo particularly is that when they looked at the solar system in our universe, that picture of a clock is where we started thinking about organizational structure, that everything functions as, and we still use the terminology today, as a well-oiled machine. So that language is there. Now, does anyone know that gentleman in the black and white picture? So if you know who he is, you can leave and I'll give you a name. Anyone? The most influential person of the 20th century. His name is Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management. Because what Frederick Taylor then is, he's the one that created the hierarchical management structures that every one of us are still under today. So in a school system, you have school board, at top, but then you have this thing called superintendent, which is the CEO of the organization. Then you have the cabinet, the central office. Then you have all these little sections. You have a high school, you have a middle school, you have an elementary school. Each one has a shop steward called a principal. And then you have this whole series of grunt workers, which are teachers. And they take care of all these little kids. That structure is very powerful in our thinking, because one of the things that scientific management did was made, particularly in the United States, made the industrial age, made the United States one of the greatest industrial powers on this earth, because it was a highly structured area. Standards were very important. Compliance was very important. Routine was very important. And so these things were ingrained in our own thinking. And the other thing is, we're all products of that structure. So if you're thinking about trying to make change in any way, is that we have to understand what's driving that. So you watch Ken Robinson's stuff. I'm sure you've seen Dr. Ken Robinson's work, and his work on creativity and his work in terms of changing schools and the industrial model. Well, you know, and I can attest to this as a superintendent who tried to make a lot of change, is that I'm constantly running up against this type of thinking, which is extremely difficult to get people to shift their thinking because it's so ingrained in us. It's ingrained in our movies. It's ingrained in our thinking over time. You know, and I mentioned Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You know, that reinforces what school was like. We loved that movie. It was great. You know, the kid was taking on the principal, that whole bit. Or Napoleon Dynamite is another great movie. Or the movie Teachers, or White Shadow, or if you remember Glee. They keep reinforcing the structure in our minds. So that's all I want you to think about, how powerful that is, particularly when you're trying to make change, and particularly if you're trying to make change in an urban environment. It's even much more powerful, you know, as we look at that. So just to prove the point, you know, and to get you to begin to think about this, is that industrialism and the schools came together. So when you look at that in the 19th century, many of the leading thinkers said that, if we're going to be successful in that, then we have to find ways to break the inherent free human spirit during childhood. So you want to make sure you get these kids into structures and into order, and make sure they all stand in line and they all work in certain types of way, because that became important for industrial working in a factory. So many of the leading theorists and thinkers during that time said that we need to make children obedient, to follow orders, and to perform highly monotonous tasks without rebelling. And when you look at early education, generally what kids would do, and those of you in Pittsburgh, you know, lived out in Pittsburgh, that's what, you know, you talk to your grandfathers or anything, 8th grade education was enough, because it got you to the point of being able to at least be able to get into these jobs in the mills. That's what you wanted. You didn't want high independent thinkers. That was for management. That was the select group that would go on. So what this then led to was this migration of the term, and this is what Russell Akoff shows you in Learning Right Side Up, is that we move from education, which means lead forth, to schooling, which is designed to standardize behavior and structure. And again, it's powerful in our culture. So what I want you to think about is this, and then really that industrialism then led to mass schooling, because we had all the immigrants coming in. We had to find ways to acculturate them into the system. And as I said, the outcome of that was we became one of the strongest industrial countries the world has ever seen. And where we still have, and you talk in your communities, you use the word of 3 R's, is that is what was necessary, because at that time we wanted to make sure that there was rudimentary writing, communication, and to be able to perform simple office functions. And so these are the mental models that really were underpinning the development of our educational system over time up to now. So I want you to think about that and kind of juxtaposition these concepts. And when you read this in Senge points a lot of these out in Schools That Learn, that these are important things for you as an individual who is becoming an educational leader to really start to grapple with, and to begin to think about how it impacts you and also impacts the structure of your organization. So, comments on this?
Well, I totally agree, because this is kind of what we see now. I think with the Common Core, we're really struggling with getting our parents to understand a new way of thinking, because they're so ingrained into this model. So from a hierarchy standpoint, you have people who went to school, so they're experts in school. We have people running the school districts who went to school, so they're experts in school. But no one has ever thought outside of this system. And now, on the radio station this morning coming in, parents were complaining that they can't do 3rd grade math in Common Core. because we're teaching the kids a totally different way. We're really not. It's just a different way of thinking.
Right.
And that's where they're stuck in this system.
Right. And that is, and what happens then is it becomes politicized. So it becomes, and what's interesting about Common Core is that when you talk to a lot of people, parents and even people in the business world, they think it's the federal government imposing this upon us. The problem is it's not the federal government. It was Bill Gates and the governors of the 50 states coming together and talking about what's needed for this emerging economy that's coming about. It was not the federal government. So the point is that now it's become a major issue of right versus the middle versus the left in terms of that. So those of you who work with school boards, you know the battle that goes on there at the political level. But it's important.
Dr. Gould, how are we going to, you talk about making that battle, but if we keep churning out people from this type of educational system, and we've been talking reform for most of my career, the early reformers, and I'm heading on up in age, but we can't seem to get off that treadmill. So how we can talk this rhetoric, but what's going to happen in changing policy? Are we reaching a tipping point?
Yeah, well, what has to happen, and I think it's starting to happen, and you'll see this more as you go through not just this particular quarter, but next quarter. There is, movement that is happening worldwide. So, for example, a friend of mine, Young Zhao, and I'm sure you've heard of Young Zhao, who grew up in China, grew up in a peasant family in China. He's now he has a presidential chair at the University of Oregon. Goes around the world talking about the dangers of standardization, particularly because the United States in general and a lot of Western cultures are picking up what China's trying to discard. And so his argument is very strong towards the fact that we need to get conversation going. So he has enough clout that he goes to state boards of education. He talks to legislators. He talks to business people. But I had him come into my doctoral class, our special ed doctoral class this summer, and he was asked that question, what are you doing? And he basically said, look, we're at this point that all we can do is to begin small conversations with the people who are in our environments and hope that the networks begin to emerge. So what I'm going to say to you, whether you're up in age or not, that one of the purposes of this program is to help you learn to become the transitional leaders that will learn the mechanisms to raise the conversation to the level it needs to be. And that's why we have you read Heifetz and Linsky, particularly. The book I've given you is their field book that came off of their book, Leadership on the Line, which talks about true leadership is very dangerous. And what it means is dangerous to you from the point of view of job security, et cetera. So the question becomes, how do we begin to raise the conversations that are necessary? So I'll use myself as an example, and I think I told you guys this in my introduction. My proudest moment as a superintendent was when I had a building of elementary teachers come to the school board after 3 years of wrestling with these concepts in the early 2000s and asked the school board to knock the walls out between their classrooms because they were moving into multi-age grouping and they were moving into teaming, and they wanted a lot of adults to interact with larger groups of kids. So to me, that's what we're talking about. And when we get into Otto Scharmer's work next quarter, right now he has a MOOC that has 31,000 people on it around the world. His first MOOC had 28,000. And what's interesting about what Otto does is that he creates or has people create what he calls localized hubs, where you get these groups of people from all works of life sitting down and beginning to talk about some of the things I'll show you in a couple minutes and what type of structural changes are going to need to take place. So let's go back to what systems thinking is. And what Peter Senge calls it is that he actually says that word systems thinking is not the word we should be using. What it is understanding networks of relationships. So the question is, how do you begin to foster the types of networks of relationships that can move us from the blah, 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 blah that we always hear in reform to actionable things that start out small but will have great impact over time. So that's what I think is important, for you to think about, and what then becomes your role then as a leader. And what's important about this, there's another thing that's happening in the 21st century, and it's really coming out of the work of several people. One is, and I think, let me see, right? Yeah, well, Albert Einstein, when he started talking about quantum mechanics and those types of theories. And then this gentleman here who just came up is Heisenberg. And I don't know how many of you remember your physics courses or are science teachers. Heisenberg principle basically is the principle that allows you to understand uncertainty. Because what Heisenberg basically said is, the second I look at something, I change it. Why? Because of these things up here, these mental models. That objectivity really is highly subjective, and not getting into physics of it. But okay, here's two people out of the 20th century, and now this gentleman right here is Fedor Capra, another physicist, but a very interesting one, because here's what Fedor has basically said, is that now we need to begin to think of organizations as living systems. And that they really create and recreate themselves by adapting to the web-like nature of our surroundings. And what he says is extremely important. The activity that you really need to understand is the concept of adaptability, diversity, and creativity are the processes. So we're getting you to begin to, in this first course, begin to play around with some of these concepts, because what has really been impacting science now is basically the development of ecological systems and understanding them differently than mechanical systems. And that so what you're reading in Peter Senge's work around this issue of sustainability in the planet really comes out of an understanding of the interrelationships of humans to other life forms to the living system of the planet. And so these types of concepts are beginning to emerge. So if you think about differentiated instruction, or if you think about differentiated or diffused leadership, they really are tied into this concept of web-like networks of humans interacting with each other. And so this is where I want you to begin to wrestle with the type of shift in thinking that's needed, that if we're going to get, to what you asked that question about, the reform, going, and really I'm just use the word blah, 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 because that's why I said to you, really what has changed over the last 40, 50 years structurally to our schools? Nothing. They still function as industrial-based, mechanical, hierarchical structures. So the idea is, so these are concepts that I think become extremely important to think about. And as Capra says, if you're going to build a sustainable society, for kids and future generations, this is what he said. We got to fundamentally redesign many of our technologies, social institutions, so as to bridge the wide gap between human design and ecological sustainable systems. So think about the Pope. So the Pope comes in and begins to talk about, this whole concept of our planet and a climate. And what does that mean? So here you have a moral leader who, by the way, is a scientist, beginning to talk about that, which runs up against some of the fundamental thinking of our economic system. So from a political point of view, you begin to see this battle between, whether or not this data is true or not, which then gets us into, as educators, the issue of how do we teach people to think scientifically or to develop inquiry skills when you're watching the political battles, particularly in this country, just decimate learning. So again, these are the types of things that you as an individual leader need to begin to, work out in terms of your own source of understanding of who you are in light of this type of information. Okay? And I know it's pretty heavy stuff to think about right now, but it's something that I want you, I'm going to keep grounding you towards this to think about it and what it means to you as educational leaders or as leaders in any type of human endeavor or organization. So I think these things, are important for us to think about. So, what's the present reality of this planet as you think about it as an educator? And you'll see these particularly next quarter, but I'm going to show this to you right now. Is this concept of what Otto Scharmer talks about is this concept of the ecological divide. And what that means basically is, and I'm sure you've read about this or heard about it, is that we basically, and this is the conservative point of view, are using 1.5 planets more than what we really have, which then brings a divide of ourselves, self with nature. Then the next one is the social divide. See, my dog doesn't agree with me, honestly, because he's arguing with me right now. So self with others is the social divide. So there's 7.3 billion people on this planet right now, of which 2.5 live in abject poverty, meaning they make less than $1.10 a day. So this, and then in our own country, we're dealing with the concept of income inequality. So what they talk about the divide is self with others. And think about the Pope again, when he came in and he talked to Congress, he talked to the United Nations, where he was talking about this need to, what's the relationship of myself to others in light of these very broad issues that we're dealing with. And then the last one is probably one of the most important ones that we have to deal with. And Otto calls it the spiritual cultural divide, and the number is 3. And what that number is, there are 3 times more suicides today, starting with data from 2010, than all the deaths from accidents, wars, and natural disasters on this planet. And I'll give you an example about that. One is, after it started looking at this, and that goes to self with the depression that is found all over the place in relationship to human beings, whether it be the vet coming back from Iraq or the war or our children. And my point is, Alan Grant, and I think most of you know Dr. Grant is. So when we were going to the funeral last night, he brought his children, his 2 children, because his wife was away, so he had to bring them. And he said to me, he said, it's really been a disastrous week, obviously. But he also said it's also not a disaster because yesterday, one of the kids in his son's class committed suicide. His son's in 6th grade. So the point that we're looking at as educators particularly is, and I think this is a very nice divide here, and I have a new one to add into it, but this idea of self to nature, given the ecological divide, self to others and self to self. So if you buy into the data that supports these, then the question as an educator, I always ask people is, how are our curriculum designed to deal with these issues? Because this is real life. This is the world in which our kids live in. So this is the type of leadership question that you begin to, that you begin to look at and becomes important in terms of our understanding. And then I'm going to put this disruption, so I want you to watch this.
When you think of automation, you probably think of this: giant, custom-built, expensive, efficient, but really dumb robots blind to the world and their own work. They were a scary kind of automation, but they haven't taken over the world because they're only cost-effective in narrow situations. But they're the old kind of automation. This is the new kind. Meet Baxter. Unlike these things, which require skilled operators and technicians and millions of dollars, Baxter has vision and can learn what you want him to do by watching you do it. And he costs less than the average annual salary of a human worker. Unlike his older brothers, he isn't pre-programmed for one specific job. He can do whatever work is within the reach of his arms. Baxter is what might be thought of as a general-purpose robot, and general purpose is a big deal. Think computers. They too started out as highly custom and highly expensive, but when cheap-ish general-purpose computers appeared, they quickly became vital to everything. A general-purpose computer can just as easily calculate change, or assign seats on an airplane, or play a game, or do anything just by swapping its software. And this huge demand for computers of all kinds is what makes them both more powerful and cheaper every year. Baxter today is the computer of the 1980s. He's not the apex, but the beginning. Even if Baxter is slow, his hourly cost is pennies worth of electricity, while his meat-based competition costs minimum wage. A tenth of the speed is still cost-effective when it's 100th the price. And while Baxter isn't as smart as some of the other things we will talk about, he's smart enough to take over many low-skilled jobs. And we've already seen how dumber robots than Baxter can replace jobs. In new supermarkets, what used to be 30 humans is now 1 human overseeing 30 cashier robots. Or take the hundreds of thousands of baristas employed worldwide. There's a barista robot coming for them. Sure, maybe your guy makes the double mocha whatever just perfect and you'd never trust anyone else, but millions of people don't care and just want a decent cup of coffee. Oh, and by the way, this robot is actually a giant network of robots that remembers who you are and how you like your coffee no matter where you are. Pretty convenient.
So the other divide, which I'm adding into this process, is really self to automation. Because your kids and my grandchildren are going to be really affected by this big time. And it's something that we need to think about. So for example, this summer, Time Magazine, obviously when the Apple Watch came out, they talked about 6 new technologies shaping classrooms. So as you look at those, and we won't spend, go into each one, but look at the textbooks that learn about students. The textbooks now, through artificial intelligence, and they're coming on the way, will adjust themselves to the needs and the aptitude of a given student. The bottom one, printers that redefine hands-on learning. So look at how 3D printers now are impacting our ability to create things, design things, build things, express ideas 3-dimensionally. So, and then the one, toys that can teach empathy. So here in the popular press, obviously, they're beginning to get us to look at new types of technologies that are going to impact our schools, but then the question comes back, are we structured appropriately for them, and how do we change that? So a gentleman that you will learn about in 802, Ray Kurzweil, who wrote the book, The Singularity is Near, and basically what that is, that he says by about 2045, if you're Star Trekians and you like Star Trek, remember the board, that what's going to happen is you're going to see the blending of robotics with the human DNA. And if you don't think that's true and it's not going to happen, take a look at prosthetics now, take a look at how we implant computer chips into people's brains with epileptic seizures, etc. And that's just the beginning because of this concept of exponential growth. And the reason I'm showing this is because I want you to think about what you're teaching today in relationship to what's emerging in the world outside of our schools, and how do we begin to structure it.
When you think lawyer, it's
One
easy to
more.
think of trials, but the bulk of lawyering is actually drafting legal documents, predicting the likely outcome and impact of lawsuits, and something called discovery, which is where boxes of paperwork gets dumped on the lawyers and they need to find the pattern or the one out-of-place transaction among it all. This can be bot work. Discovery, in particular, is already not a human job in many law firms. Not because there isn't paperwork to go through, there's more of it than ever, but because clever research bots shift through millions of emails and memos and accounts in hours, not weeks, crushing human researchers in terms of not just cost and time, but most importantly, accuracy. Bots don't get sleepy reading through a million emails. But that's the simple stuff. IBM has a bot named Watson. You may have seen him on TV destroy humans at Jeopardy, but that was just a fun side project for him. Watson's day job is to be the best doctor in the world, to understand what people say in their own words and give back accurate diagnoses. He's already doing that at Sloan Kettering, giving guidance on lung cancer treatments. Just as autos don't need to be perfect, they just need to make fewer mistakes than humans, the same goes for doctor bots. Human doctors are by no means perfect. The frequency and severity of misdiagnoses are terrifying, and human doctors are severely limited in dealing with a human's complicated medical history. Understanding every drug and every drug's interaction with every other drug is beyond the scope of human knowability, especially when there are research robots whose whole job it is to test thousands of new drugs at a time. And human doctors can only improve through their own experiences. Doctor bots can learn from the experience of every doctor bot, can read the latest in medical research and keep track of everything that happens to all their patients worldwide and make correlations that would be impossible to find otherwise. Not all doctors will go away, but when the doctor bots are comparable to humans and they're only as far away as your phone, the need for general doctors will be less. So professionals, white-collar workers, and low-skill workers all have things to worry about from automation.
So just to add to this a little bit for you, to begin to look at this. Now, if you want to see this video, it's told, just go out on YouTube, and the video is called Humans Need Not Apply. Runs 15 minutes. Very interesting video, and I'll show you where this video is supported by a very, very interesting book in a couple minutes. But again, okay, so you looked at Baxter. What was interesting, when I saw this video for the first time this summer, I was watching it, I get the Wall Street Journal. And 2 days after I watched this, I open up the Wall Street Journal and there's a picture of Baxter. And they're talking about how Baxter is going to change the dimension of a lot of the low-skill works. And Baxter only costs $25,000. So if you remember what they said in there, the cost of Baxter's initial cost, the amount of electricity, and I love the concept, the word they used, it's meat-based competition. So automation is going to impact the sustainability of our kids down the road in many different ways. So the question is that the type of question we're asking ourselves collectively as teachers and as administrators? How does this Common Core fit into the reality of this emerging world? Now, it might fit perfectly, but the question is this the type of dialogue or conversations that we're having? So, as you saw or are seeing in Peter's book, he basically says that there's this three-legged stool that you need to really understand as an emerging leader. And that first one is you got to be able to see systems. You have to see the network of connections that are taking place with an organization. You also have to understand the need to collaborate across boundaries. So, for example, when I was a superintendent, when I was interviewing a teacher to be a science teacher, the very first question I always asked them, I'd ask them, what is the language of science? And what I was looking for is the language of science, mathematics. And so one of the ways in which you structurally get people to do that is you don't have the math department sitting over there by itself, meeting by itself. Why not have math and science to meet together? Why not have math and music meet together? Because if you think about what music is, it is the putting into mathematical concepts into sound. So you think about an eighth note. You want to teach fractions. Music's a great way of doing it. So collaborating across boundaries is extremely important concept. And the last one then is creating desired futures. Now, I'm not talking about strategic planning. I'm talking about getting people to sit down and begin to identify what is the common shared sense of the future that we need to have in order to deal with the mission of what our organization is about. So these three, the three-legged stool is extremely important for a leader to begin to understand as they move forward. And then when you look at that, then setting a context for this, and so what Peter talks about, and I think you've read this or you will be reading this, is that the guiding principles then for a sustainable future within an organization starts out that there's really no visible path forward that does not take into account the needs of future generations. So when you ask the question about what are we supposed to do, how are we supposed to get people involved, well, that's what we have to do. Get them exposed to emerging ideas and concepts, such as I'm giving you right now, to begin to ask the question, how robust then is our learning environment for that to happen? The other thing is, institutions do matter. You do need to have institutions. They're the organizing principle around a set of common goals and beliefs where we're going, whether it be a school, a church, or a business, etc. Institutions are very important. And finally, really, all real change is grounded in new ways of thinking and perceiving. And so the more you understand how the 17th, the 18th, 19th, and 20th century have influenced the present behavior in our own thinking, that's where you can begin to start getting people to think about shifts in their thinking that are necessary, to deal with this. Now, it's not easy, obviously. So let me see, what is my next one? I got to remember what my next. So when you think about this, so you look at that iceberg again, and we looked at this a little bit, and we'll go into these in more detail in other Zooms, is that really what this gives you, the event, the patterns, the systemic structures, is a framework for you to develop leverage in understanding complexity. And so what I really want you to think about is, how I didn't change this. How do we use this as, a means of generating meaningful conversation? How do we get people to feel that it's okay to say what they believe, which gets into the trust issues, which you'll read a lot about when you're working with Heifetz and Linsky's book in particular. So let me conclude, I think, with one little clip. I think I have one little clip for you to look at. No, I saw this in the paper the other day. So the iceberg is around. So if you read that. So we got the tip of the iceberg, which is the event level, suing the rest of the iceberg, which is below. So obviously, if you ever watch Whammo, the cartoons, I thought that was kind of interesting that all of a sudden now we're starting to look at the iceberg as a pretty good model in understanding how to develop the leverage. And so here's the conclusion of this last part of the clip that I'd like you just to look at. No, I don't. Don't worry about it. What I want you really to look at is, here's the book I highly recommend you to get a hold of and to read, even though you don't have too many books to read right now. I'm giving you another one. This one gives you all of the facts behind the whole issue of that video called, Humans Need Not Apply. Both of these guys are at the Digital Business Center at MIT. This book, as you can see, has been a bestseller, but it gives you all of the data we need to think about in terms of preparing our kids, for the future and what it is. And when they talk about education, they really rip into it, except for one particular form of education, and that is Montessori. And they talk about Montessori, why Montessori as a model makes a lot of sense for educating our kids for the future. So what I want to end with then is basically this, and I've showed this to you before. So as a leader, this is really what you have to deal with. You know, how do people think? What are their mental models? What are their belief structures, their assumptions, how they see the world? Any change process, you cannot make or try to make people comply to change. You have to do it by fostering commitment through conversation, generative learning, and development. So this is kind of what I wanted to give you tonight to really hit you with what the structure is, to allow it to percolate in your minds over the next week or so. And when you get into your reflective conversation groups, you know, I'd like you to kind of play around with these ideas. If questions emerge out of them, you know, send me those questions or let me know when you might have it. If I'm available, I can come in. But I'd rather you know, formulate a series of questions that you want to throw out to me and to the rest of the groups that, you know, help to surface your own thinking about this stuff, because obviously I hit you with a lot right now, but I did it purposely to allow it to, you know, kind of percolate over the next couple of days. So any comments or questions? The first pitch, I think, is about 20 minutes away, so we're okay, for those of you out in Pittsburgh particularly, or Cubs fans. So any comments, questions? Okay, let's go Bucks. Or Cubs, or whatever. As I said, my Yankees aren't in it anymore, so I don't care. So any parting thoughts or questions you might have for me after being barraged with all of this information?
John, where do you think technology, you know, lies in this whole process? I'm not in the, you know, the K through 12 setting. I'm in the, you know, athletic and college realm, but where do you see it taking shape? And you mentioned the Montessori model.
Right.
What differentiates, you know, them from, I guess, regular public schools?
Well, what differentiates them, and as he points out, is that one of the major qualities is that they're self-organizing. They're not structured daily. They focus on the strengths of the kids and not the deficits of the kids. Now, think about it from building a team. When, you know, I've always said this, that many times if coaches would, and again, I'm looking at this as the K-12 environment, that a lot of times you would see football coaches as being history teachers or social studies teachers, which is kind of interesting. And I'd always marvel at the fact that you watch how coaches coach a team to become the best it can become, but then you watch them in the classroom, you see the old model begin to emerge. So if and I know what, you're an assistant coach, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so think about what are the structures of how you bring out the individual assets of a player to mold them into the function of a team. So the model, I think, you know, fits quite well. But again, remember, every one of those kids that are on your team are influenced by everything that we expose them to. You know, they're learning, and how they learn is there. You know, they're products of that system. So the question I would ask you is as you look at their learning compared to how they, quote, learn in a classroom, what are the differences? What do I notice them to be? And obviously not to answer that now, but something to think about.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
So anything else for the good of the order? If not, we are recording this. And, you know, for people who weren't there, and if you want to go back and look at it again, fine. Or if you want to look at the video, just go out to YouTube. Humans Need Not Apply. You know, it is excellent material, you know, to get you to begin to think about what are the realities of the world outside of the realities of school. I want you to think about that. And those three divides I talked about, we will go into those in much more detail, particularly when we get into the second quarter. I think it's now It used to be 625. It's now called 845. We get into Theory U. Okay? So if there is nothing else at this point, I'm going to turn the record off. And